flying saucers. The enigmatic spacecraft that had appeared from time to time through the centuries would now take center stage. The age of innocence was over. The wave of modern UFO sightings began simply, with no photos, no radar returns, and no physical evidence. Just a story told by one man at the right time in history.
The fascination with unidentified flying objects can be traced to a day in June 1947, and to one man, Kenneth Arnold.
He was not a guy who read science fiction. He was not a guy who had any occult interests. He was not a guy with a lot of imagination. He lived pretty close to the ground mentally, but he loved to fly. And so on the Tuesday afternoon of June 24th, 1947, when he saw these 9 dish-shaped objects flying at some considerable speed over Mount Rainier, he thought that he was witnessing a secret military experiment.
Every newspaper across the nation has made headlines out of it, and this afternoon we are honored indeed to have here in our studio Kenneth Arnold, who we believe may be able to give us a first-hand account and give you the same on what happened. Go ahead, Kenneth.
They looked something like a pie plate that was cut in half with a sort of a convex triangle in the rear. I'd be glad to confirm it with my hands on a Bible because I did see it. It's just as much a mystery to me as it is to everyone else who's been calling me the last 24 hours wondering what it was.
The press referred to the 9 objects Arnold said he saw as flying saucers.
Arnold was such a straight shooter. He was so clearly puzzled. There was no possibility that this guy was making up a strange story. Arnold's sighting just seemed to catalyze everything. All of a sudden, there was this presence of something unidentified in the sky that couldn't be ignored. And in the next 2 or 3 weeks, there were many hundreds of sightings.
Army fighter planes are on patrol for flying saucers. Cameras installed to photograph them.
So many objects were being seen in the sky by so many people that the Army Air Force launched an investigation.
They're seeing flying saucers everywhere.
And on September the 23rd, 1947, General Nathan Twining issued a memo that said quite categorically, the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious.
When it appeared that technological devices of some kind were penetrating American airspace, and we didn't know what they were and had no idea what to do about them, this was obviously a national security problem.
It was the beginning of the Cold War, and what Americans feared most was being attacked by the Soviet Union.
We didn't know what they might have flying. And so those concerns by the government, legitimate concerns by the government for our security, led eventually to them establishing a full-time office to investigate UFOs.
The Air Force investigators quickly came to realize that they were not dealing with Soviet aircraft. Nothing man-made performed like flying saucers.
They started thinking, well, if the Soviets aren't doing this, there's really no thing on Earth that can be doing this.
And then on July the 24th, 1948, 2 experienced commercial pilots, Clarence Childs and John Whitehead, were flying at night over Alabama when they encountered what they described as a cigar-shaped object, perhaps 100 feet long, flying faster than any aircraft they had ever seen. It had, they said, 2 rows of windows, and they could see lights inside, and orange-red flames shooting out of the tail. Air Force investigators couldn't explain it.
It could not possibly fly unless it had an engine in it that was beyond anything anybody on Earth could make. And this, in a sense, was their proof that they were dealing with the extraterrestrial technology.
The Air Force investigators trusted the testimony of these experienced pilots and were forced to consider the incredible. Since 1948, there have been thousands of sightings by commercial and military flight crews.
March the 12th, 1977. I was flying a trip from San Francisco to Boston, nonstop in a DC-10.
It was an Airbus 320, and we had 24 passengers on board with very good condition. We were at 39,000 feet.
We were just north of Dallas-Fort Worth. It was a beautiful, clear night.
Out of nowhere, some lights appeared. Looking over to the left of me, just to the north of me,
I noticed a red light of some kind to the far, the distance off our port side, our right side.
And Larry says, well, keep an eye on it. He says, well, now it's coming at us.
And they began a turn from pointing directly at us in an echelon sort of a turn away.
It was not a plane, it was not a weather balloon. It was huge, absolutely huge. It was dark red color. And so this object began to become transparent and it disappeared. It was absolutely crazy. Crazy.
It just was gliding through the sky so quietly, and as it did so, it blotted out the stars behind it. And it just reminded me of a submarine in the depths when it's quiet and just kind of motoring right on through, you know.
There were no wings, there were no windows, and it was cigar-shaped.
I saw what I saw, and this thing was not from here.
I watched this big, gigantic light go out behind our left wingtip, and then as the turn progressed, it disappeared in the distance off to the back at a very high rate of speed. I've flown all the jets. I flew in the war. I flew B-17s in the war. Everything. I've got over 30,000 hours of flight time and never had a sighting as that one. So it was once in a lifetime.
In the fall of 1948, Air Force investigators were convinced by the testimony of pilots. In a remarkable top-secret report to General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force's Chief of Staff, the investigators said the Earth was being visited by alien spaceships.
They took it so seriously that they risked their own careers by writing an estimate of the situation that they sent on to higher headquarters and said that some of these UFOs could be extraterrestrial, which of course was not received well by the Pentagon.
Hoyt Vandenberg looked at this thing and he said, I cannot accept this. I cannot accept this kind of conclusion because you don't have concrete proof that that's what kind of a device we're dealing with.
The eyewitness accounts from experienced pilots were not enough for the general. The Air Force wanted the flying saucer phenomena to go away, but the popular fascination with mysterious flying objects was growing. In 1952, the Air Force received more UFO reports than any other year in history.
The sky is the stage, the actors, so-called flying saucers. And they're back on the scene with some new twists.
This is a photograph of a flying saucer taken by myself, and it reminded me of two straw hats stuck together at the brim.
I saw an intensely bright, white-green object in the sky. Now, I wouldn't want to say that this was one of those so-called flying saucers, but whatever it was an object and not an illusion.
The Air Force had really tried to downplay the UFO problem. But by the summer of 1952, there was an enormous wave of sightings. There were hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of sightings. Most alarmingly, the sightings were focused on Washington, D.C. At least 3 radar systems in Washington and the area were picking up unidentified targets.
This very much worried people in Washington because it looked like penetration of the most important airspace in the country.
In July 1952, the Pentagon's communication system was overwhelmed by calls about UFOs.
The number of calls of frightened Americans, hysterical Americans coming into the switchboards of the American government were clogging communication channels. And if American communication channels were clogged, then this would leave America vulnerable to a potential Soviet attack. So the task is calm the furor, end the hysteria.
It was public hysteria, not the flying saucers themselves, that threatened the national security. President Truman ordered the CIA to make recommendations on how the Air Force should handle the UFO problem. The CIA convened a panel headed by the physicist H.P. Robertson.
The Robertson panel says we must do something to remove the aura of mystery from the UFO phenomena so that people no longer take them seriously and don't bother to report them. That's what we want.
So flying saucers, whatever they were, wherever they came from, were to be made the subject of ridicule. But it was impossible to control the public interest. The public was fascinated. One of the most widely read magazine articles at the time proclaimed, "The flying saucers are real." One of the most respected publications in America, Life magazine, published photographs.